Coming in from lunch here. So welcome to the System Center 2012 Orchestrator Crash Course. My name is Pete Zerger. I'm a managing principal consultant for Infront Consulting Group, Cloud and Data Center MVP. And I'll let my colleague introduce himself.
Thanks. So my name is Anders Bengtsson. I'm a senior PFE at Microsoft, working with automation and integration, so it's System Center. Been at Microsoft for 3 years, and before that I was a System Center MVP together with Pete.
Yeah, in the world of Orchestrator, Anders is more than famous. He is infamous, we like to say. So if you are an Orchestrator user, we would encourage you to go out and order the greatest / only book on System Center 2012 Orchestrator, coming soon, the Orchestrator Unleashed book that Anders and I and a couple of our colleagues put together over the last year or so, coming this summer. So we wanted to take a minute and just level set what we're hoping to accomplish here today. So our idea today is to really show you the value of Orchestrator and really, in the next 75 minutes, bring you to a point that you can walk out of this session with an appreciation that you know what you're going to do next and that you can be productive with Orchestrator in your environment just right out of the gate. So maybe we'll start with a poll here. How many of you would say that you are very experienced / an expert with Orchestrator? So show of hands. So no hands. That's a good thing. This is a level 200 session, so we're really hoping to just help you to hit the ground running.
Good. It was like a half hand.
A half a hand?
Yeah, like half, like I don't really know.
Were you? I'm not sure if you were. So how many of you in your environment are using scripting and scheduled tasks to a fair degree? Yeah, so a lot of you. This is great. This is great. And how many of you would say you have those scripts out there where not many people are quite sure what they do? You don't really want to touch them. They're sort of ugly. Yeah, they're like a proper Louisiana gator sitting over in the corner. They're kind of ugly. We don't want to get near them, right?
The rest of you might actually have scripts, but you're not really aware of them yet. But they are there somewhere in some dark server room doing something that no one really understands.
Yes, we all have our ugly babies, so to speak. So, our objectives today, we're going to start with a quick overview of Orchestrator architecture. You're going to find that Orchestrator architecturally is very easy to understand. It's very quick to deploy. So we're not going to spend a lot of time there. Before you really go back to your environment and begin pushing the buttons and making the automation happen, we want to talk about planning. So we're going to have a crash course on the decision criteria, the questions we need to ask ourselves to understand what exactly we should automate. Anders will take you through some best practices. So as we get through some of our initial introductory runbooks, we'll evolve into best practices. We'll look at several use case scenarios. So we're going to default to the side of hands-on. We'll talk a bit about how the runbook engine works behind the scenes. Now, we do have quite a lot of content, so we'd ask that you keep your questions to the end of the session. We'll have a bit of time at the end. We won't be going anywhere after, and certainly we have a couple of hours tomorrow at the speaker Q&A, so if you want to come and talk and whiteboard and what have you, we're not here doing anything else this week, so we're happy to visit all you like. So Orchestrator really is designed to take us beyond traditional scripting. And you may find that you have automation scenarios that center around monitoring and remediating faults in your environment, automating provisioning, integrating service request automation. Lots of areas in our environment where we need to automate, and Orchestrator is really designed to bring all of those elements together. I like to think of my runbooks as little hamsters in their wheel, and each is doing something that I've asked it to do. So I am sort of the master of the hamster. If you're one of those people that didn't raise your hand, to scripting in your environment, then you're the hamster, right? So hopefully we're going to help you sort of evolve your role, a bit of a job upgrade today as we move along. So I like to think of Orchestrator as a Visio-like experience, yeah. So I have, what do you call it, a palette, let's say, a workspace, a canvas. And I can drag and drop activities onto my canvas, activities that will perform various tasks. They might query a service, talk to a database, deploy a virtual machine. Doesn't matter really. I'll find through the Microsoft catalog and out in the community groups of activities. We call them integration packs that are product or function specific. You'll find integration packs for System Center components, for Active Directory, for Exchange, lots of integration packs out there to add to your default Orchestrator environment. Off the shelf, several dozen, 85-ish standard activities that perform a variety of functions, from querying Windows services to talking to Unix systems to working with the file system. So a variety of native activities that allow us to automate a lot before we even think about those product-specific groups of activities. And we can drag those activities onto the palette, onto our workspace, connect them together, link them up to create runbooks. So let's talk a bit about the Orchestrator data bus. This is actually going to be really important to understanding how runbooks execute through our automation process. So this data bus is a shared space where every activity in our runbook that is executed publishes data. And this data publishing happens automatically. We don't have to do anything to achieve that. And every subsequent activity in our runbook, at our option, can subscribe to or consume data from the other activities that have been initiated previously in our environment. So that allows us to be very dynamic with our runbooks, because we can react to conditions as they're encountered at runtime. So as our runbook progresses, activity number 2 can consume data from activity number 1, and activity number 3 can consume data from activities number 1 and 2. And all of this is actually happening. This shared data bus lives in the context of a Windows process. So every time you hit the Go button and you have a runbook that's in some stage of execution, it's running within a Windows process called policymodule.exe. And each of your runbooks will have its own process. When the runbook ceases execution, then that process folds up, goes away, and your data is lost. The good news is we do have some capability to publish data out of that runbook, so we can share data between runbooks as we evolve our automation efforts. So I think I'm going to stop talking, and I'm going to let Anders jump in here and maybe do some demonstration, and we'll give you a good look at Orchestrator hands-on.
Yeah, thanks. So before we go into the demo, I just want to mention our next session. That's tomorrow afternoon.
Yeah, tomorrow 5 p.m.
So tomorrow at 5 p.m. we will go through all the integration packs that came with Service Pack 1, and also a lot of the integration packs that we released with Orchestrator 2012. So if you're interested in seeing more examples of what you can do with the different integration packs, please attend our session tomorrow afternoon.
Yeah, absolutely. And that'll be very use case scenario focused. Everybody has their common use cases, but we tried to pick some of those 80%ers that should cover the majority of the folks that come pay us a visit tomorrow.
Yeah.
Show us something cool. How about
Orchestrator. So as you can see, how many of you are working with the rest of the System Center today, the other components? Most of you. Yeah,
good,
so
good.
Yeah, that's good. That's nice. Then you should have Orchestrator too. As you can see, Orchestrator doesn't really look like the other components. When looking at the runbook designer, this console is our tool to design our runbooks. That's because Microsoft bought a company, Opalis, in the end of 2009.
Right.
And then we released Orchestrator with System Center 2012. So a lot of the things here still looks very much like Opalis did when it was its own product. So it has a little bit different background than the other System Center components. But it's quite nice.
Suffice it to say, I think the UI is nice, and Microsoft have really focused on enhancing the functionality under the hood and
updating
bringing
integration packs and so on.
Yeah.
So what we have here is on the left side, let me zoom, we have a navigation pane where you create all your runbooks, and that's what Pete showed us before. When you have all the activities connected together, you get your runbooks, like this one here. So you can create a really nice folder structure here, nice names on all your runbooks, and divide them into folders as like a file server where you have your different folders and your different files in each folder.
And I can secure those folders, right? So
Absolutely. So you can, on each of these, you can do right-click, permissions, and then it actually looks like a file server. or a file security settings. And you can go in here and you can say that this group should have permissions to start this runbook, and this group should have permission to edit it, and so on and so on.
Yeah, you'll find those permissions are 100% self-explanatory with the exception of the publish permission, which actually gives you the ability to control someone's capability to hit the go button, the start arrow, to initiate a runbook.
Yeah. And then we have global settings down here that we will come back to later. And in the top of the console, we have a run and stop, and that, of course, run starts the runbook, stop stops the runbook. Quite.
Thanks for clearing that up.
Yeah, I know you had some questions about it earlier today.
Appreciate that.
And you can do check-in, check-out. Check-out means that you will copy the runbook down to your local machine, and you can edit it. And when you have checked it out, no one else can edit it or use it in any way. So when it's checked out, no one can use it, no one can modify it except you. Then we have the runbook tester over here, which is another console we can use to test our runbooks. And let me start that one. Check out my runbook. It's starting here.
So I think the most interesting thing about the runbook tester is the name, the runbook tester. Can be a bit misleading in some respects.
Yeah, so the tricky part with the runbook tester here is that it's actually not testing anything. It's running as you will run it in production. And it's running locally on your machine with your account. So if you have specified some extra permissions for your Orchestrator service accounts, it's not using your service account, and it's not running on your Orchestrator machines. Instead, it's running on your local machine with your local account. So that might bring some challenges, especially as it's not testing anything. It's really running here. So it's a quite nice tool to step through your runbook and verify input, output everywhere, but you should be aware that it's really running. It's not testing anything. And there is no undo button here. So
yeah, it's great. It gives you these capabilities up here to step through activity by activity, and down here in the bottom pane you get very detailed, verbose logging. The one challenge being that it's actually executing for real. So if we're deleting accounts from Active Directory, we're actually deleting accounts from Active Directory. So yeah,
we had a support case in the beginning. Well, now it was almost a year ago because it was just before last summer, where a customer had created this really nice runbook about cleaning up old accounts in Active Directory. It's a good scenario, good use of Orchestrator, nothing wrong there. Just that they have put this older than, they turn it to the wrong way. So instead of moving accounts that haven't been used for 6 months, they moved all accounts that had been used for 6 months. They cleared the password, cleared all the properties, moved them down to another organization unit in AD. And Orchestrator is a quite quick tool, so it didn't take many seconds. And the whole IT department became a little bit like in a bad mood. I went to them and was going to help them. Yeah, we have an Orchestrator issue. Yeah, to start with, we couldn't really log on to the console because that account was also removed. And I said, I don't really think you have an Orchestrator issue. I think you have like an AD disaster recovery thing. So make sure that you actually test your runbooks somewhere else than in your production environment.
Make sure you're 100% clear on greater than and less than. Suffice it to say.
Yeah. So that's the runbook tester. And then here on the right side, we have all the activities that Pete was talking about, and we see them in different categories. So we have all the standard activities, system, file management, utilities, and so on. And with the standard activities, they are really not bound to any specific product. Like we have one here called query database, this one. The query database activity can query any database. So it doesn't have to be configuration manager or system center or something. It could be your
Oracle, MySQL.
And it could be like your some kind of business application database you have. So they are not really connected to any specific product or technology. You can use them for anything.
Yeah, suffice it to say, this is not integration for just Microsoft components. This is heterogeneous integration. If you want to talk to Unix systems, you want to talk to web services, You want to run commands on a Windows machine, you want to run commands on a router. Orchestrator can do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And then we have all those integration packs that are specific for one product or one component. For example, here with Operation Manager, we have a number of activities that will only work with Operation Manager. For example, create alert or get monitor or start maintenance mode. Those activities are very specific for Operation Manager. And we have for the rest of System Center here, we have Active Directory, and then we have normal things like add, remove to groups, create, disable, delete, reset passwords, all kind of different tasks that we do. So we have all the standard activities, and then we can import all these specific integration packs.
Yeah, and your integration packs, coming from Microsoft, many are free, many community-developed integration packs out on Codeplex, and Microsoft absolutely recommends that if you need an integration pack that they haven't developed that's out on Codeplex, download it, test it, use it. It doesn't create a supportability issue. It's an encouraged activity.
For the community IPs?
Yes.
Yeah, so there are a lot of community IPs, as Pete said, but just make sure that you really test them before you put them into production, because someone maybe created them and it works really nice in that environment, but in your environment you have some specified add-on parameter or something.
Yeah, fair to say you want to test it. I mean, downloading a community-developed integration pack would be like using one of my PowerShell scripts. If you don't test it reasonably well, I don't feel sorry for you. So, what else do you have for us?
So, also here, if we want to create a new runbook, we right-click here, and do New Runbook. And it's quite simple. We just drag and drop whatever we want to have. And in this example, we can monitor a folder for new files and insert that into the database. It's quite an easy one.
Okay, so we're going to monitor for a file, and then we're going to read some information from that file, and then insert that into a database, just as an example.
Yeah.
I think those file system monitoring activities tend to be where a lot of people start. There are a lot of common scenarios in this world related to log file management or reading, requests out of log files, etc.
So I drag and drop a couple of activities here. Monitor a file. When you want to monitor a folder for a new file, you use the monitor file activity. That's quite, of course, you do that. Yeah. You connect them with links.
So you notice when Anders mouses over an activity, he gets a little triangle. We call that a link handle. And when he gets to the crosshair, he left-click and holds and drags. Yeah. So quite simple to link those up.
So and then it's time to configure them. We double-click. And which folder do we want to monitor? Maybe this one. What do we want to monitor for? Let's say file name .order or and what do we want to trigger? We want to trigger created. So if there is a new file in the folder, we want to trigger this monitor or this runbook. So the runbook will always be running in terms that it will always monitor this folder, and as soon as it finds a new folder, a new file in the folder, it will trigger the runbook to run the rest of the activities.
Now, so when we link those activities together, the default behavior is when activity A executes successfully, it automatically triggers activity B with no delay, and so on and so forth.
So if we go into the next activity here, that is read line. So we want to read the first line in this file that we just monitored and found and detected in the folder. We have file here. We need to specify the file, and that could be a bit complicated, as the only thing we know is that the file name is a .order. But this is where the data bus comes in. So we can right-click in any text field in Orchestrator, subscribe, and do publish data. And now this is the second activity in this runbook. So there is only one activity to pick data from. So I only have one here. And I pick name and path of the file. And you see all this is data that activity published to the data bus. So now this activity can use it as input data. So I pick the name and the file of the folder, and then do. And
so Orchestrator is automatically showing Anders here all of the activities that are guaranteed to have executed before he gets to this activity. So we can consume the data, that published data, as we like.
Yeah, and I want to read line number 1. I could do 1 to end, but I just want the first one. Then I want to write that to the database, and I put the jobs. And in here, field name, value, I do right-click again, publish data, and now you see we have two previous activities that I can pick data from. So this time I could pick from the read line text, like that.
And this is really part of the beauty of Orchestrator. You know, when I write a script, I have to manually determine, you know, what's going to happen at runtime. I've got to think a lot harder to develop, you know, this sort of dynamic behavior in my script. So within Orchestrator, I'm going to be able to respond dynamically based on the values I get out of that text file at runtime without thinking too much about it.
Exactly. But what if this write to database doesn't work? Then we might want to have a, let's go down here, Operation Manager, create alert, add that one. We drag a new link here, but this time we go into the link and we say if the write to database returns failed, we want to go this way. And maybe to make it really easy to understand, we make it a little bit wider and maybe red. Okay, and we do.
So now Anders is creating what we call branching. So he's
like
changing that default link behavior of automatically execute, and he's actually looking at the result of the activity before and now creating some intelligent logic in here. He's color coding his link, so when I come in behind him, you know, I'm not looking at his ugly little alligator in the corner and trying to spend, you know, hours figuring out what his code's doing. I can look at this runbook and visually have a decent idea of what's going on in a couple of minutes' time, right?
Yeah, and now when you're thinking about how to use the Operation Manager activity, you can see up here we have connection. You need to pick one Operation Manager environment you want to work with. And it's quite nice because you set them up here on options. You configure all the Operation Manager environments that you want to work with, and you can have a number of Operation Manager environments that you can work with. And then you just pick one when you're working with the activities. So creating a runbook is not that complicated. You drag and drop a couple of activities, you connect them with links, maybe you configure the links a little bit, you configure the activities, you check it in, you click run, and then you can see the result down here on log history and log if it's already running. Not too complicated at all. There is one more thing I want to show.
Okay.
Yeah.
You're allowed.
Thanks. It's not really its own integration pack, but it's quite nice to know about when you start working with Orchestrator. And we have something called data manipulation functions built into Orchestrator. And if you open the built-in help, and search for data manipulation, you will find this list of everything, all the different functions. And you see we have functions to convert text to uppercase to lowercase. We have functions to pick like the two first letters from the left side or right side and so on. So in this scenario, I read a file. Let me show you the file. I read this file with a name, a company, and a phone number. And I write it in a send platform event. A send platform event will always show up down here in the console. And let me find it here.
Yeah, so at the end of the day, if you need to parse text or numeric data, you know, left, right, in, string, etc., very easy to use the data manipulation functions, you know, just as you would in script.
Yeah. And as you can see here, we can take the name, we divide that string, the whole string, with the comma, and then we get John Connor. We divide that on the space, and we get the first name, and we take the two first letters from the left, and then we convert them to capitals. And you can mix these, let me show them how these look. You can mix these functions, field functions, or data manipulation function in any way you want. So as you can see here, we mix a number of them together to get what we wanted. In this case, we wanted the first two letters in the first name.
Yeah, so by the documentation, you can nest these functions up to 3 levels deep.
Yeah, I actually have 5 here, but, well.
And it still works.
Yeah, it works. I guess that's a feature.
That's a feature.
That's
SP1.
a feature. Yeah. So, yeah. So I think that's it. We have looked at the runbook designer. We have looked at how to build a runbook. It's quite easy, drag and drop, connect them together activities. We see that it's much easier to work with a runbook in here than working with like a 500-line script. You don't really need to think about anything in Orchestrator. You just drag, drop, and pick the data from the data bus. You don't have to think about the format.
Yeah, that's a great point. So, Anders' objective here was not to make you an expert at monitoring files, but to show you just how easy it is to put a runbook together and to develop that advanced logic. I mean, to develop a script, I mean, even PowerShell, which is a very succinct and fairly intuitive language to most of us, right? If I were going to monitor for a file and retrieve information from that file and write that to a database, and if my database write failed, actually detect that write failed and log an alert in Operations Manager, and if it succeeded, send an email to my neighbor, that would take me probably a few hours to put that together. And Anders did that in about 8 to 10 minutes.
Yeah, and it's much, much easier for some colleague to go in there and update a runbook than updating a PowerShell script or a VB script or some other language script.
Yeah, that's a great point. One of the fundamental principles of Orchestrator is you should develop automation that's more broadly supportable across your organization. So we don't have to all be PowerShell gurus to make that happen. So let's look at Orchestrator architecture for just a bit. So I mentioned that the Orchestrator architecture is very simple to understand. So it all starts with the Orchestrator database. Like all System Center components, Orchestrator is database driven. You can make this highly available through HA mechanisms with SQL, to which you're already accustomed, clustering, always on if we're working with SQL 2012. And that database is quite important, yeah? So all of your configuration lives in that database, all of your runbooks live in that database, all of your security lives in that database, so back up the database. And our runbooks are initiated from the runbook server. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean the runbook server is doing all the work. Perhaps you build a runbook as we did earlier where you're monitoring a file on a remote server. You may build a runbook that is initiating a program on a remote system or a group of remote systems. So the runbook server itself is not necessarily doing a great deal of heavy lifting because the activity is still going to be distributed out to those systems that you want to work with. Bear in mind that Orchestrator is not an agent-driven architecture, so I'm not deploying agents to those systems. I'm spawning a remote process. Think PSExec. Very similar to that, spawned on that remote system, which means that you're...
It actually really depends, because it depends on the integration pack. So some integration packs, they maybe use some remote execution tool.
Right.
Some integration pack use the normal SDK connection. Some integration packs are using PowerShell and so on and so on. So it's really up to each integration pack how it will communicate with the target system.
So the bottom line is, how much does a runbook consume in terms of resources? The answer is it depends. So some are going to be very lightweight, some will be a little bit heavier. Typically we're going to be able to scale into the hundreds of runbooks on a single server, though, generally speaking. And if I want to make my runbook servers highly available, I stand up a second one, which involves running a wizard that takes less than 5 minutes. Really quite simple. And Orchestrator works on what we call a waterfall model. So if my primary Orchestrator runbook server fails to heartbeat for 3 periods, so 15 seconds times 3, the secondary server will pick up and take over automatically. It'll spin up those runbooks and manage where the primary left off. Now, granted, we can override that on a per runbook basis, right?
Where you want it to start?
Right.
You can actually do it if you add invoke runbook activity in your runbook. So one runbook could trigger another runbook, and when you trigger another runbook from your first runbook, you can actually specify where you want it to run, on which runbook server.
So we can spread the load for our heavier footprint runbooks.
One quite common scenario I see with the secondary runbook server here is that when you have different networks or different customers, let's say you're a hosting company, or let's say you have a number of secured networks within your organization, maybe you can't place one runbook server somewhere that can communicate with all the different target systems. Instead, you need to place one runbook server on each secured network, and then that runbook server can communicate back to the database. So
Yeah, great point. Making sure that you have LAN connectivity to your database. So you don't want to stand runbook servers up on the other side of a WAN from the database. That's not going to be a sustainable situation from an architecture perspective. Orchestrator comes with a web interface as well, the orchestration console, where your operators, the people who are not authoring the runbooks, but the people who are using them and consuming them, can go to a Silverlight-based console. They can search for their runbooks. They can launch them, provide input if they need to supply input into the runbooks. They can even click a little visual element that will show them a picture of the runbook, very much as it appears to you in your runbook designer console where you're authoring those runbooks. Maybe you haven't adopted the entire System Center family yet, and you have other management systems that you work with, and you might like to initiate a runbook from outside Orchestrator. So to trigger a runbook in Orchestrator from outside, that's where the Orchestrator web service comes into play. That's a RESTful OData web service. I can very easily, from PowerShell, C#, from a URL, initiate a runbook externally in Orchestrator. I could even use that to initiate runbooks between Orchestrator instances if I wanted to do something globally orchestrated, as an example. So the management server is not a component we have to worry about from a high availability perspective. The management server is a service, a Windows service, through which your runbook designer console and your deployment manager communicate to the database. So when we're editing runbooks, when we're importing new integration packs, it's this management server service that's going to be leveraged to write that data in. But this is a design time component, not a runtime component. We can recover this very quickly, very easily. So don't worry about the management server for HA. Now in this picture here, we've actually shown these Orchestrator roles spread all across these servers. So what do you have to say about that, Anders?
Well, you could actually deploy them all on one machine, and that could be a virtual machine if you want to. And then later on scale out. Because Orchestrator is a bit different than the other System Center components, because you really need to know what you're going to do before you do the design. And it could be quite difficult to know that when you start looking at Orchestrator and implementing Orchestrator. Maybe you want to start with Orchestrator just to feel it, play a little bit with it, see what you can do and what you can't do. So you can deploy everything in one machine, and then later you can move the database, you can add more runbook servers if you want to, you can move around the web roles also if you want to. And that's the same discussion if someone is thinking about firewall ports here. Well, it all depends on what you're going to integrate with. Because if you're going to communicate with AD, that's one set of ports. If you communicate with Operation Manager, that's one set of firewall ports. And as Pete said, we don't have an agent here, so it's really up to each target system, each system that we're going to integrate with, what port we will use. So you can start really small here, and then you can scale out.
Yeah, and place your runbook servers to meet your connectivity requirements. But we can more quickly integrate across disparate components. Doesn't matter if it's just Microsoft. We can get into many enterprise management components out there. And Microsoft even makes integration packs that will integrate with platforms like vSphere, BMC, HP, CA. I could go on. So we can orchestrate these distributed processes and automate the processes in our environment that make the most sense to put on autopilot, and not necessarily 100% autopilot. There's always going to be a need for a smart person in the chair with the right training to hit the approve button at appropriate intervals, etc. So the idea is it gives you a job upgrade. Just a quick checkpoint here. So we've covered off Orchestrator architecture, fairly simple. You can put together a single server Orchestrator environment in a few minutes' time. It's quite easy to do. Very intuitive wizard. We talked about scalability in HA for a bit. Again, fairly straightforward. Stand up 2 runbook servers, cluster or always on for SQL. Anders took us through building our first runbook. So we put some activities on the palette, linked them together, configured some branching, some of that advanced logic, some of the intelligence. So now at least we have one hamster in the wheel doing our bidding, right? So that's the idea. Over time, we're going to build many little hamsters and wheels doing what we want.
Yeah, like a circus of hamsters.
Yes,
yeah.
The conductor of our own hamster circus. So
you just want more of them?
So how many activities do you find your average run book contains?
Maybe 5 to 10.
5 to 10 activities. So Anders in our social circles is the master of Orchestrator, and he has 5 to 10 activities in his run books. That is to say, his run books are modular. They're function specific. So he might have run books that go look up a group distinguished name in Active Directory. He has another that just logs error messages. He has another that maybe sends email notification to people. So we're building small, easy to manage, troubleshoot and support, and highly reusable run books. So there are problems in my own environment that a year ago or 2 years ago I would have told you might take me a week to solve, and sometimes that answer is now, give me 15 minutes. I'll just go link some of my run books from my library together, and I have quite a library of automation there, just one run book at a time that builds up because we're following that practice of just keeping it simple. So let's talk about the planning side of things. So before you go, building run books, it's very easy when you watch Anders do it. You say, you know what, I can go open the console and I can start building run books, and actually you can. Orchestrator is one of those components. Who in here has not ever worked with Orchestrator? Give me just a show of hands. So Orchestrator is a component that you can learn in a month of Friday afternoons. So if you spend 8 hours with this component, you're going to be pretty good after a day. You're going to find that it's intuitive and you can ramp very, very quickly. And because we're integrating with other systems, you're going to learn bits and pieces about other systems that maybe you don't have a lot of knowledge in today, because you're just going to dabble into function-specific integrations, right? So a great way to spread out across a System Center suite into your heterogeneous integration scenarios. But anyway, I digress. So let's take a step back. You go to the office and you're ready to provide some thought leadership. Where do we start orchestrating? How am I going to make a big splash in the organization? So a good place to start is just to get your team together and just make an automation wish list. Just start writing down, what processes do we have that are time consuming? Where in our environment do we have service levels that are suffering and people are noticing? What problems do we have happening over and over and over again that are irritating us? What do we have out there that's expensive? Do we have a problem that's maybe costing the company money in terms of, our internal or our pay-the-bills type customers? And what process failures do we have out there that are visible? Because if they're visible to customers, they're visible to some executive somewhere, right? And nobody ever wants that call where the executive, spots the problem before you do. And I can remember back in the days of traditional scripting, I worked for a CEO in a Fortune 500 who spent, I think, about 65% of his day hitting F5 on our website, and he was watching for the booking engine on his website to go down. And you never wanted a call from that guy because it was never good news. So we want to spot those challenges and think about those as potential candidates for automation. So getting that wish list together is the first step. So I find when I look at that wish list, a lot of times I'll try to make a guess as to which processes I think are going to float to the top of that list as my best candidates, and I will find that often I do not guess correctly. And that's because we need to ask ourselves several questions before the authoring actually begins. So the question is never, can I do this with Orchestrator? I think you can do just about anything with Orchestrator.
Yeah. I have seen so many. One of my customers that tried to replace BizTalk with Orchestrator. They had this really expensive BizTalk consultants, and saw Orchestrator. Thought this seems quite easy to work with. Why don't we it's doing almost the same, they thought, and we could just get rid of all the expensive consultants. But no, and you should not try to replace Operation Manager with Orchestrator, even if you can monitor most of the stuff. Don't try to run your MSE package and do deployment from Orchestrator, even if you could. There is another component that is quite good at that.
That's a great point. So the question is never, can I do this with Orchestrator, because the answer is totally yes. The question is, should I do this with Orchestrator? So I don't want to replace another component. I want to make runbooks that are modular, that are function specific, that are highly reusable, and supplement or complement the other technologies I have in my environment. Orchestrator is going to be a journey for you, and the question really is, are you going to be running in the right direction? Because you're going to wind up in a very good place or a very dark place. I had a customer that I walked in the door and they said, "Oh yeah, we're using Orchestrator. We're deploying, groups of virtual machines with our private cloud. I can hit this button and deploy 2 web servers and a SQL server and connect them to my load balancer, and the shin bone connects to the leg bone." And he opened his console to a run book that had more than 150 activities. It had 15 branches of logic. So as I emotionally just shut down, and I'm looking at these run books where he's copying files and initiating MSI execs, and what really struck me was this guy actually sat in the cube adjacent to the config manager admin, to the SCCM guy. And I'm like, why would you not just deploy with config man? Well, we don't really get along, blah, blah, blah. So, some sort of... So at the end of the day, he had actually painted himself into this horrible corner where now they had an operational risk because he had that alligator in the corner that nobody wanted to pay attention to. He actually left that organization, and they had to hire him back as a consultant to support that process. So he'd taken them to a very bad place. So you're going to wind up somewhere. Let's just hope it's in a good place. Is my automation technically feasible? So if I have a number of systems I want to interact with, I have to understand what their data sources are, right? How I'm going to connect with those systems. I need to think about what sort of capabilities I'm going to need on my team if I'm integrating with these systems. If I'm doing something that requires JavaScripting or C#, and I'm not a .NET developer, then this probably isn't going to be great from a technical feasibility perspective, right? And then we think about cost and development effort. So at the end of the day, what you're going to find, if you're doing this right, this very much has a not boring, very important financial component, and it's going to be very black and white where we should spend our time with this sort of automation. So I need to be thinking about what is my time to break even, right? So where does that ROI swing into the green? And then to Anders' point, what ports and permissions is this going to use? So Anders had suggested, putting a runbook server over in the perimeter network, yeah?
Yeah, but this is a quite common discussion. We want to start automate and we want to start integrate, but then when you sit down with the runbook designer, you realize that, Orchestrator will have quite some permissions in AD, in Exchange, in SharePoint, in all different environments we have, and then when you start discussing that with the security team, they're like, no, that's not going to happen. And so start with that very early, that whole discussion, and also try to map what kind of permissions and ports you will require. So do that before you start actually building the runbooks.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a great point. And be thinking about your service desk, about ITSM before you get started. You want to make sure that your automation, links back to incidents and service requests, etc. Anders has some opinions about that, and I think what he said is I think a lot of automation...
Yeah, so most of the automation will actually trigger based on some kind of work item. If you think about it, most likely because you get an incident or a change request or a service request or something. So why don't integrate with Orchestrator from the beginning? So don't build your runbooks to be like standalone, where you click the button and fill in all the information. Design them from the beginning to connect with your tool and to get the information from that tool and then report back when they're done.
Yeah, great point. And always plan with Murphy's Law in mind. Murphy lives here. It's never going to be quite as fast, quite as easy as you think it's going to be. I find my run books, especially as I get into more complex integration scenarios, it never works exactly as I envisioned beforehand. So there's going to be some trial and error and some iterations in that process.
So really make sure that you're using Orchestrator what it's supposed to be used. Even if you could figure out some other scenario, try to use it what is built to be used for. It's like if you buy a card to a gym card, like a membership there, that will not make you any slim if you don't go there and use the stuff that's in the gym. It's the same with Orchestrator. Just because you deploy it, if you're not using it in the right way, it will not do anything good for you.
Yeah, I know who that gym analogy is for. I appreciate that, Anders. So let's just take a couple of examples here. So number one, I have a manual task. Could be anything. Creating a user account, provisioning new mailboxes. Comes up once a month. We have a new employee come in once a month. It takes me about 20 minutes to build this out. And I figure if I wanted to automate this, it's going to take me, let's say, a week to do it. So in that case, 20 minutes times 12 times a year is about 4 hours, right? And if I'm going to take 40 hours to build this automation, I think I can make my money back faster. I can double my money in 10 years, anywhere other than under my mattress maybe. So this isn't going to be a great candidate. Now, on the other hand, let's take a common scenario, probably for most of us. I have Windows services, and maybe in 1,000 servers I have, maybe one Windows service a day that's going to fail, and it's going to raise an alert in Operations Manager. It takes 5 minutes to get a ticket logged and for the Tier 1 support to escalate to Tier 2, who's going to run back to their desk and log into something and restart the service. So we've got 20 minutes in that process at minimum, right? That's not even thinking about the end users, the customers that might be affected, and then SLAs. Maybe Tier 2 has a 4-hour response SLA or something, so we could be sitting there for a long time. So if I had a week to build that runbook, and let me be very clear, it would not take you a week to build this runbook. I think you could download a copy off Anders' blog and customize it to your environment in less than half a day. So in that case, even at a week to build that, I'm looking at 121 hours a year and recouping my money in 4 months or less. So it's really this simple. We might think, I don't need to really be thinking about ROI, but really you do. This is exactly how you're going to prioritize your runbook automation efforts. So there is the technical aspect of sorting out which runbooks, from a technical perspective, are easy for you to build, but also you want to think about the time investment and how we're going to get those, hard or soft dollars back.
And in this example, we also have to think about what if someone else is sitting and waiting for these 20 minutes? Then it's actually 40 minutes every time. Or just because you escalate something to the second line doesn't mean that they start working with it. Maybe they will start within 4 hours or something, or 6 hours or something, so it will actually take even longer. Or what if second line, every second time or third time they do it, they do some human errors, so it takes 2 hours extra to restore the service. Orchestrator will not make any human errors. It will do exactly what you tell it to do over and over again.
Yes, it will do exactly what you tell it over and over again, which can be awesome or very un-awesome, depending on what you're telling it to do. So scenario 3, and this is something that comes up all the time, and it's going to happen to every one of you, and I'm going to tell you exactly how you deal with this. So you're going to sit in front of somebody who has some pretty big ideas, and they want to build Skynet. And so they're going to start describing this process where we're going to monitor System A, and it's going to connect into System B, and it might log some data in System C and trigger a response in System D. And we think you could build this for us in 14 to 18 months. And now I've never used Orchestrator, so I'm not an expert, but I'm just saying I think this is a good idea. These ideas to me, it doesn't really matter who's speaking it, but you remember Charlie Brown, the teachers, wah, wah, wah. So after about the third sentence, that's all I hear. You just smile, and it's just Charlie Brown's teacher. My eyes glaze over, and I'm done. I saw Terminator, did you?
Yeah, and it didn't really work out very well in the movie, so it will not really work out in the real world either, so just don't do it.
It's going to be equally bad. It may not involve robots or time travel, but it's going to be equally bad in a very real sense of the word, for sure. So the idea is to take all of those technical criteria, and we want to sort out the processes that recur frequently, that have a moderate amount of automation effort, something that we can build with a modest amount of effort, especially initially, right, when we're new to Orchestrator. There are a lot of quick wins you're going to find when you go through this process. We want to make sure also that we look at a process, because at the end of the day, when I'm trying to take a process out of somebody's hands and put it into Orchestrator, I'm replacing what a person does, which is a very complex computer, right? So I need to think about exceptions and variants. So is that process that person is performing manually, is that something I can automate reliably every time? And if there's variance in that process, can I control that variance? Do I have a place where I can go look up the answers when the data varies from one time to the next to the next? And think about the quality of your processes. You want to make sure that the processes you're trying to automate are good processes. They're processes everybody is on board with. You've documented these. They're tested. They're accepted generally by the population. Because as Anders said, Orchestrator is going to do exactly what you tell it to do. So Orchestrator is not going to take a bad process and make it good. If a process sucks outside of Orchestrator, it's going to suck inside Orchestrator. It's just going to suck faster and more reliably, just every time, right? It's going to magnify the sucking noise that you hear in the background. So we want hamsters running in the wheels, running in the right direction, doing what we want, coordinating with one another. We're orchestrating our little hamsters in the wheel at the end of the day.
Yeah, so you always want more hamsters to play with and to feed and to just love, and you just want more and more of them when you start working with Orchestrator.
That's exactly right. So
some runbook best practice here. First one, of course, always rename your activities. So when you see the runbook, you should actually understand what it's doing. So rename your activities, and we will see that in a demo soon. Also change the colors of all your links. I normally use green, red, yellow. Quite easy to understand. Green is good, red is not that good, and yellow is something in between. For example, if you have different branches within your runbook, so depending on the result from an activity, you want the runbook to go this way or this way. Maybe you configure those two links to be yellow, just to show that the runbook could take any path there. Both of them are okay. It depends on the previous result. Then, of course, build a good structure and naming convention within Runbook Designer. When you start moving your runbooks between environments, or when you start integrating with Service Manager, if you don't have a good naming convention, something will be messed up there. It's absolutely sure something will be messed up. For example, if let's say your AD team is building a set of runbooks that other teams can use, if they don't use a good naming convention, how do you even know which runbook to use? So no, that will not work very good. So try to build a really good structure, a good naming convention.
So how do you prefer to name your runbooks? What's your preferred naming convention? Do you sort yours by function, by department?
More like function and scenario.
Yeah, so the important takeaway there is not exactly how you do it, it's that you do it. Sit down with your team, come up with some standards, so when you go home and sleep at night and you come back the next day, you remember where to find things.
Yeah, and it's the same with the link colors. Use whatever link colors you want, as long as you use some link colors, and the rest of your organization also use the same link colors.
Yeah, I mean, we talked to a guy at MMS that used blue and orange and purple, but that was their standard, so that was okay.
Yeah, it's nice. Company colors. Yeah, try to use dynamic values. So don't input a lot of hard-coded values in your runbooks, because when you're moving them between environments, or if you update the target system in some way, you have to go in and reconfigure all your activities. Instead, use variables or use some kind of query, some other data source to get the information, and then run your runbook. And then try to build your runbook from left to right. So moving from the left part of the screen to the right part of the screen. Don't do like left to top to right, and then you realize, oh, my screen is not big enough. Well, let's go back left again, and you start a new line. It's like, shouldn't do that. If you need to do that, it's time to divide your runbook into smaller pieces, and we often call them parent runbook and child runbook. Like you have a parent runbook invoking child runbooks, and then the child runbooks return the data back to the parent runbook. So try to build your runbooks as functions then instead. Maybe your different team can build different functions, and then when you're building one big scenario, you just invoke the different smaller runbooks. And remember to do your planning very carefully, and then test. As Pete said earlier, if you have a bad process, it will not get any better because you move it into a new tool. Instead, it will just mess up even more quicker. So make sure you really test your runbooks and cover all kind of scenarios. Pete and I, we had a session at MMS that you can go to Channel 9 and download. That's the session code there. where we talked about best practice in a whole session. So there is a lot more best practice. So if you're interested, please go and watch that session at Channel 9.
Yeah, definitely as you're developing your runbooks and you start thinking about, how do I manage runbooks across multiple environments and promote those runbooks from development to test and staging to production. That session at MMS is actually a level 300 session, really focused on some of those big questions that are going to help you take your next steps in that respect. Okay, so one more checkpoint. So now we've covered off identifying best candidates for automation. Fairly straightforward, yeah? Okay. Best practices for runbook authoring. So we've got through the naming and the color coding and the left to right, organizing our runbooks kind of like reading words on a page, right? Let's get back in the console and let's look at the runbook engine here. So I'm going to hand off to Anders for a demonstration we call Rules of the Data Bus.
Thank you. So I want to show you a couple of different examples how the data bus will behave inside of Orchestrator. So in this scenario, this first example, we have reading a text file that contains only one line. And when you run this, you will soon see here, it will run the read line activity and then the send platform event. So for each execution, the next activity will run the same amount of times as the previous activity's result. So in this scenario, I have one line, so the next activity will run one time. And the next one after that, if I had more, would also run one time. But if we then do like here, where I have a new text file with 4 lines, if we run this one, we can see that, you see, we read the line, four lines in that text file. So the next activity will run 4 times. And if we had more activities, the entire runbook is now running in 4 threads.
So when we have multi-value data, the default is going to be that the downstream activity is going to execute one time for each piece of data in that multi-value set, which could be great sometimes, and then there are other times where maybe you're reading a bunch of information from a file and you want to maybe stick that into an email or something, and then this is going to be very not cool, right? Because I'm going to trigger an email or an event 4 times and log something, parts of something over and over.
And this is quite important to understand when start working with Orchestrator. For let's say you're querying a database and it returns 600 rows. Yeah. Then the rest of the runbook will run 600 threads. That could put your Orchestrator environment into a little bit of a bad mood.
Yeah, that's going to fall in the heavy footprint category for sure.
So my next example, I have reading the same line, the same text file again, 4 lines, but this time I have configured flatten and told it to use a comma. So what this activity now will do is read the entire file as the last time, but it will return all answers with a comma between them. So if we go down here, we can see that read line was executed once and send platform was executed once. And if we go into events.
So you saw what Anders did there when he flattened the data. He picked a separator of comma. There was also a line break in there, which is great when you want to format something nice for an event or an email because it's going to knock them out just one line at a time. You can supply any separators you want. I've seen people using commonly things like semicolons and commas. I saw one guy that wrote "Hello World" as a separator, and yes, that works. Maybe not the best example,
in this
but it's very
example,
flexible.
You see that the line text was 1, 2, 3, 4. And those were actually was on their own row in the text line. But when we use flatten, it's all returned as one long answer. And that might be good in some scenarios, and you can use the data manipulation functions that are built into Orchestrator then to divide that answer into smaller parts. As I'm doing here, I divided on the comma and then print the first, second, the third, and the fourth result here. So sometimes it's good to use flatten. If you, for example, want to send it in an email or something, you don't want to send 600 emails or 4 emails in this example, then it's quite nice to use flatten. And the last one, we have also configured flatten, but we have also configured looping on the activity. So we told the activity to run 3 times with 10 seconds between each attempt.
So how did you tell that activity to run 3 times? Can you show us that in the UI there?
So looping, delay between attempts 10, and exit, number of attempts equal 3. So after 3 times, and it's quite important to configure our exit on activities in Orchestrator when you're using loops, because else they will stand there forever.
So loops come in handy when you're doing things like checking to see when a server's come back up after a reboot, or maybe you recycle IS and you want to hit a hit a URL until it comes back online. That looping is going to come in handy in that in a lot of situations, really.
And the result here is that we get the send platform event once with the flattened result. But if we look at log history, we can see that read line was actually executed 3 times, but we flattened the result. So even if it's executed multiple times, when we're using flattening, it will just return one answer.
So the real lesson to learn there is that we can flatten data, but we can't flatten execution, right? So it only gave us the 1 bit of data output, but the execution still ran 3 times according to the loop. So that's the rules of the data bus. Can anybody tell me what the first rule of the data bus is? Yeah, you get a copy of Orchestrator Unleashed. Come down and give me your name when this is done. You're awesome.
So we could just jump into the next demo.
Yeah, please. So we're just going to jump into one more demo here and look at some use cases, I believe.
Actually 2.
2?
Yeah, so...
Sorry, I was just going to hit the next one and make sure I'm not totally... Yep, there we go. So now we're going to take these run books and we're going to evolve these into something a little more exciting with Anders' examples here.
Yeah, so here we have a run book that is deploying a new web service in Windows Azure, and that works really nice. As you can see, it's 6 activities. We don't really need more than that. We have this first activity just to get all the input parameters that we need, and then it formats the datetime, it creates the cloud service, it uploads some configuration packages, and it deploys the service. It works fine. But a couple of minutes from now, you will understand that it's actually not really working.
Yeah, that's a good point. So really the default logic of those links is if the activity triggers, then it was successful in the mind of Orchestrator, right? So it's going to automatically trigger those related activities. So if you're running a script or connecting to a database, success, the definition of success really depends on what you were trying to achieve, right? Yeah. So it might be something very different.
So this is how we often start with building our runbooks. We just start out really simple, drag drop a couple of activities and make sure that we actually can build what we want to build, and then we start adding on all the other things that I will show you now. So the first thing we could start adding on is renaming our activities and renaming links. As you can see, it's a little bit easier to understand now, especially if you see it like that. So we changed the link colors, we changed the names. It's a little bit easier to get it now. But then we realized that sometimes it doesn't work, so we add on some arrow handling. In this case, I have added on generate alert in Operation Manager. So if any of these 4 fail, it goes this way down and generate a generic alert in Operation Manager, saying that something went wrong in here, please investigate.
Yeah, so this runbook at the basis of it is quite a bit different than the first example Anders showed you where we were monitoring a folder. So with a runbook where we're monitoring anything, a folder for alerts, whatever, when we hit that start button, that runbook is monitoring perpetually, right? That's what we call a monitoring type runbook. So you notice in this runbook, Anders has an initialized data activity so he can accept input on demand. So this runbook's only going to execute when we call it. We call these ad hoc runbooks. Yeah.
So what you also would like to add here is some kind of verification of what you think that the Orchestrator runbook is doing. And what you can do then, I will show you an example first, just to make sure that you get the challenge here. In this example here, I have a run command activity that just copies a file between 2 local folders. And if I run it, it will return green. Green is good. But if we open it up, still green. And we look at the pure output here. You see, the system cannot find the file specified. So the activity is happy because it managed to start a command prompt and run the command. It doesn't really care about if the command is working in there. In this case, it couldn't find the file. So when you're building your runbooks, it's a good idea to add on some verification to the other activities, the previous activities in your runbook. So in my case, I add on a get internet application status. So after I have deployed the web service, I'm actually connecting to the web service to make sure that it's actually there, it's running, it's returning the data that I want.
Yeah, it's a fantastic idea in a variety of scenarios. If we're provisioning a new user in a mailbox, it's a great idea to just add another activity on there to go get user, get mailbox, and make sure that we know the activities we've just carried out actually did what we think they did before we go back and update a service request or send an email to someone saying that we're done with their request.
So the next challenge here is something that Pete talked about. What if the runbook doesn't really work? Even if we cluster a SQL database, as you mentioned in the beginning, and we deploy a number of runbook servers, this challenge is that when if the runbook is running and the runbook server goes offline for some reason, it will fail over to the secondary runbook server. That's a good thing. Yeah? But it will restart at the first activity. Yeah? So it will fail over and restart at the first activity. So let's say that you have let's say you're creating a new service account or a new account in Active Directory. You have just created the account, you create a mailbox, and you're just about to create the home folder or a user folder, and then for some reason it's interrupted. So it fails over to the secondary runbook server, starts all over again, but this time that user account is already created in AD, so it creates the user account with another name, creates a new mailbox, but the normal one is already taken because the old runbook just did that. So it's create another one, and then create a user folder, and then it's done. But the result is that somewhere in your AD, there is a user account that no one will ever use. Yeah? And that you need to handle on runbook design level. So the failover part is nice. We have that in the Orchestrator infrastructure. Mm-hmm. But it will still restart at the first activity. So what you need to do is to build that into your runbooks. And then you could go from like 4 activities to 54 activities to handle that, because it's suddenly became a little bit more complicated as you need to check each step before you execute it. Is this step already done for this request? Have I already done this for this request? And so on. So in this example here, I have added on some cleanup activities. So for example, if this one fails, it will go and delete the cloud service it just created. And if this one fails, it will delete the cloud service and delete the container.
Yeah, so our mother doesn't work here. We have to clean up after ourselves is what it comes down to. So you want to think about those scenarios where your process might fail somewhere in the middle, because when it fails over to that secondary runbook server, it's going to start at the beginning. So it's going to be a fantastic idea to go check and make sure that user and mailbox don't already exist, or that cloud service is not already deployed in some partial capacity.
And as you can see now, the runbook starts getting a little bit of like an activity swamp. There's a lot of activities in here. So then it's time to divide it into smaller pieces. So in this example, I have one parent runbook that is just invoking. I just cut the other runbook into smaller pieces, and I have pasted that into new runbooks. So it's the same activities, it's just in their own runbooks right now. And I have a parent runbook here that is just invoking them, waiting for them to be completed, and then returning the data back, and it goes on to the next one.
So you see these little yellow, red, blue icons? That's an invoke runbook activity. You want to double click on one of those, Anders? So you see if a runbook requires input, as many of our ad hoc runbooks will, we can supply the input right here. We can supply it with dynamic data. I know as Anders was showing us that runbook with 15 or 20 activities, I get a little bit uncomfortable seeing runbooks that are that big, so it made me feel better when he jumped in and showed us modular runbooks. So you're going to use these invoke runbook activities quite a lot. Yeah, and it's a really nice way to, because it's so much easier now to troubleshoot and follow because it's smaller parts. Then another thing you want to add is a logging. As soon as this runbook is done, it deletes the databus, everything you had on your databus. So if you want to go in and check later the details, like why did this activity go this way, what was the output here, and so on, you need to add all that. You need to build that on yourself in your runbooks.
And we often recommend to use like a SQL server, and you just invoke a runbook that is writing to that SQL database. So you use a SQL database for your logs. You do like one central logging database for all your runbooks. So you get the same format there, and it's easy to monitor with Operation Manager and so on. It's a good way, but you still need to build it yourself. That's quite important to know.
Yeah, and in fact, as you get started, you might want some sample runbooks to get you started. So remember this URL. It's orchestrator.codeplex.com. If you go out there, you'll find that there are literally hundreds of sample runbooks. You can download a zip file, you can import them into your test Orchestrator instance, and get a look at a lot of examples,
yeah.
Right?
So this is one example. If your runbook shows up this way, you need to go back and redo the design because something went wrong somewhere.
Wow. You know, I struggle to imagine how he even built that.
Yeah. So
I'm just not going to think about how you built that.
no, so as you could see, the runbook could start really simple. I had 6 activities in the first one, and then we added on fault tolerance, we added on error handling, we added on, and we added on, and we added on. And this really simple runbook, when we realized that we want to have all that other functions in it to really make sure it's actually working, then it gets a little bit more complicated.
So now we've covered off runbook engine behavior. So we covered the one-to-one execution to one execution, and we covered multiple data items, right? 5 multiple items triggers multiple executions until we flatten that data. And then we added looping, and we saw that we can flatten data, but we can't flatten execution, right? So those are really the core fundamentals you want to have in hand as you're building your runbooks and working with data sets. Anders added some advanced error handling. In fact, in those many modular, utility-type runbooks we've always got a runbook down there that's really just meant for error logging, to give us that centralized logging, whether we're writing out to an event log or to a SQL database, as Anders said. Yeah. That's the more sophisticated way to do it because it's centralized at that point.
So when we are building our runbooks, we really want to cover these 5 phases in a runbook. So you want to design your runbooks to start in some way. You want to collect all the data you need. You need to validate all that data. So if you need a first name, make sure you actually have a first name. Then you need to store it somewhere, because if you ask the same data source twice during the runbook execution, there is always a risk that you get different answers, and then the runbook will not really work because it's running with different input parameters. And then you want to execute the runbook. So the first 4 here requires a lot of work to get that into Orchestrator in your runbook. But what you could do is synchronize your runbooks over to Service Manager and use Service Manager to invoke your runbooks, because then you have all the data validation functions already. You build that in Service Manager, so you can't post a work item in there if it's not correctly filled in the form. You have a record of everything. You can build your runbook to query the Service Manager work item to get all the data. And then you have Orchestrator only as the doer that execute and then report back. So you really don't need to use Service Manager as your incident, change, and release management tool. You can just use it as like a UI in front of Orchestrator. I just want to show you the portal here.
Yeah, so definitely not a zero-sum game. So how many of you out there have another service desk solution deployed in your environment today? So virtually everybody, right? So at least a good percentage. So you don't have to replace your service desk solution to use Orchestrator with Service Manager as a nice front end.
No, so I fully understand that it's often when you start showing this to customers, it's a quite big project to replace like the incident management tool you have today. It's also a lot of political decisions often around that. So what we have done is that we implement Service Manager in front of Orchestrator just to use it as like a UI for Orchestrator. Because if you see here, we require a lot of input parameters for our runbook to work, to deploy this web service in Azure. And if you fill in anything wrong here, well, you will not get a web service, you will get something else. If it's deploying anything, it might just fail. But if you synchronize it over to Service Manager, you can use the Service Manager web portal, and it's all default function. You just create a connector, you create a template, and you publish it up in the web portal. And you can see here, I can fill in, and you can see on the right side, there is a little box saying what kind of value I need to fill in here. So I don't have to build the whole data validation thing in my runbook. Service Manager handles that for me. And if my runbook needs to restart somewhere, it just queries Service Manager again. Have I done this for this service request as I go and create that account? Have I done this for the service request? And it just reports back to Service Manager all the time. So we're just using Service Manager because it's bringing a lot of value to Orchestrator. Even if you're not using it as your primary process tool, it still brings a lot of value to Orchestrator environments.
Yeah, the data validation is free. A lot of UI-driven capability to check a box for numeric values, text-based strings, email addresses, etc.
And you get it all in there because when you start with Orchestrator, you want to have some kind of like approval steps and all that kind of things before you deploy a new VM and so on. Everything that is already in Service Manager. You don't have to invent it again.
Yeah, good point.
So. Time to summarize.
Okay, so hopefully you have a good idea that Orchestrator is well within your grasp. Fairly easy to implement, something you can deploy in a few minutes' time. And again, a single box deployment is possible. That database is very lightweight. So what's the default database size? It's
7 megabytes.
7 megabytes. So if you want to put it on a shared server at 7 megs, that's okay.
And if you manage to get it over 1 gigabyte, please make a screenshot and send it to me. That would be like the first time ever.
Yeah, you have to work pretty hard to make that database heavyweight. So lots of native integration. If you come to our session tomorrow, 5 p.m., we'll look at some of the additional integration possibilities with integration packs that will connect us into System Center and third-party components. And self-service with Service Manager as an option.
Yeah. Good. So that's it. So please fill in the evaluation, and as always, be honest but generous. Thank you.